I'm Mike Coen, and welcome to the Western Pacific Oregon Division, my proto-freelance version of the Western Pacific as if it built all the way from Northern California up over the Cascade Mountains and into Portland, Oregon. This layout has been in existence for about 13 years, and those of you that have been watching the TSG channel for some time may remember the first video on this layout that was done 4 or 5 years ago. I believe that it was TSG's very first HO scale privately owned layout tour. Considerable work has been done on this layout, especially in the scenery department, but also some changes and some evolutions as I've conducted ops sessions over the years. And so as we take a tour, I will point out some of the changes that have occurred on the layout and point out some of the things I've learned building, which is my very first full-scale, large HO scale layout. I've had others that were smaller and less complete, but this is by far the most complete layout I've ever built. This is also going to be a bit of a love letter to this layout because pretty soon it will be dismantled. I'm planning on retiring and moving to Reno, Nevada, where a new iteration of the layout will rise in a much better space, much bigger and with wider aisles and hopefully longer runs and a little better designed and a little better built. So we're going to take a tour starting in the modeled portion of the layout in Klamath Falls and winding up in Portland, Oregon. Okay, welcome to Klamath Falls Yard, the beginning of the WP Oregon Division. This yard is about 6 tracks wide. It is a stub-ended yard, so all traffic starting or ending on the layout comes here. Some of the things that are different from the very first video is obviously the backdrop. The backdrop I experimented with by cutting out a profile board out of masonite and then painting it with acrylics to somewhat resemble Klamath Falls. Klamath Falls is a little more arid than this. It's not as forested, but I just wanted to play around with technique. And a lot of this layout is about learning techniques and trying out different things. This was going to be my forever layout, the best that I could do. But because I am moving, this has now turned into an experiment. I've learned a huge amount on this layout, and I've made a lot of mistakes on it too, and those mistakes are translating into knowledge, which for my next layout are going to come in very, very handy. All kinds of little mistakes, all kinds of changes have occurred on this layout. Also, as I've conducted operating sessions, that's the acid test for a model train layout, is when you have guests over and you're operating either as open house or as a full-fledged operating session. That's when the little quirks and the little details come out. And I've made a lot of changes based on feedback from those operating sessions. I want to throw in, on another topic, the fact that it is very important to prep your layout space before you start building it. This layout space was a pretty dingy place when we first bought our house, but I saw the potential. We remodeled the house after living here for about 7 or 8 years, and I had this whole layout space sheetrocked and lit. I had it professionally wired so that the lighting is all on one circuit and all the power outlets are on another circuit, controlled from outside the layout room in my garage, which is right next door. So preparation of your layout space is key. Have the sheetrock done, have the walls painted. I had all the walls painted a light blue, and that's really come in handy, not having to go back and paint stuff when I can just paint the foreground backdrop instead of the very, very back. The light blue that you see here was all painted by a contractor before there was any bench work put up in this space. We'll be following a drag freight led by former California Zephyr locomotive 803A. This is a Klamath Falls to Springfield Yard drag that will go down the mountain and usually services industries along the way. The drag freight's now approaching West Tremont Junction, and it's emerging from behind a row of about 3 houses that are up on blue foam. Eventually that was going to be scenic, but this allows for the illusion of longer distances traveled by obscuring the terrain and making it harder to see. Legendary layout designer John Armstrong recommended that you do a lot of scenery breaks to increase the illusion of distance, since in our model railroad worlds we're constrained by the size of the room and the amount of track that we have. I think this whole layout has about 6 scale miles of track, so that's not a whole lot when you're modeling almost the entirety of Oregon. Next up, the drag freight is seen passing the northbound Coast Starlight, an early Amtrak era train with one Southern Pacific locomotive on the point and one former Southern Pacific locomotive now painted in Amtrak colors. This train represents the earliest Amtrak, when most of the cars were still painted in the predecessor roads paint schemes, with a few Amtrak cars and locomotives thrown in, circa 1972-73. Next up is the meet at West Summit with BN 1741, a very rare chop nose GP9. Now that the drag freight has passed, the BN 1741 will proceed. summit on my railroad is almost 57 inches off the floor. So now that the drag freight has left Summit, it's all downhill all the way to Springfield Yard. We're headed down into the Willamette River Canyon, and it is the longest stretch of uninterrupted single track on the railroad. This was unscenic in the first video and now has full scenery for most of the way. This is one area where I've learned a whole lot about different scenic techniques as well as construction techniques. For instance, on one part of it, I built on solid plywood sub-roadbed, and on another part, I used masonite spline roadbed. So I'm going to take all of that to my new layout and apply what worked and discard what didn't work. A lot of people really like spline roadbed. I like the way it's laid out. It makes beautiful curves, but it is tricky to work with. I wouldn't recommend it for somebody who's new at building a railroad. Get someone who is familiar with how to build it properly. It took a lot of extra work for me to lay the cork roadbed on top of the spline. The drag freight is about to enter Oak Ridge. This is Oak Ridge, Oregon, not Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where the Oak Ridge boys are from. We will be meeting Burlington Northern 6438 on another freight headed up the hill. Here we see the drag freight rolling out of Oak Ridge and past the scrap yard that I built down below what was eventually going to be a large cement plant. And on the new layout, it probably will be again. I even built a little half backdrop that cuts off to make that a self-contained scene, and again, increase the illusion of distance. We now see the drag freight rolling up to Springfield Junction. You'll notice just to his right and your left, the engine terminal, which is a major service point on the WP Oregon division. This is Springfield Yard. It has 11 tracks. It has 7 tracks that are through tracks, 4 tracks that are stub-ended for classifying cars, and total capacity is over 150 cars. Obviously, WP, the prototype, didn't have certain motive power because they didn't need it. But seeing as how WP, in my realm, runs in Oregon, and pulls heavy lumber drags, they'd have to have somewhat different motive power. And it's a much bigger railroad than the prototype WP. As an example, I've got WP 3615 here. It's an Athearn SD40-2 that I have painted and detailed using details that match other WP locomotive practices, such as the nose Mars light, the 5-chime air horn, MU hose, cans on the front pilot, all of those things that were WP practices in a 6-axle locomotive. I've done, as part of proto-freelancing, a bunch of what some modelers refer to as foobies. Well, that's a derogatory term in some cases, but in my case, it's necessary and it's a lot of fun to do locomotives that maybe WP would have had they actually ran all the way up to Portland, Oregon and encountered the stiff grades of the Cascade Mountains. Another example is the SD38-2 2051. Obviously, Western Pacific never had 6-axle locomotives of its own, although it leased locomotives from the Union Pacific. And one of my favorite parts of WP was all the Burlington Northern and predecessor road run-through power that they had in the early 1970s. That's my justification for modeling this railroad the way it is. You'll also see one of my favorite locomotives is Sacramento Northern 735. Now that's a chop-nosed Jeep 7. That is an Intermountain model, and I got it painted solid orange and just lettered for ICG. Well, the orange was pretty close to WP orange, so I modified it, put WP specific details on it, and it turned out really well enough that I got an award at the local NMRA meet for building that locomotive. I'm quite proud of that one. Plus, the Intermountain locomotives have lighted number boards, individual headlights, lighted class lights, and a really nice Loc-Sound sound system. So that's a great locomotive. I run it all the time. One other one is a Sacramento Northern MP15 that I have painted in the green. Well, SN never had an MP15s. Most of what they had was either Alcos and a couple of Jeep 7s cast off from the WP. Well, I decided to build one just because I think it would be a cool locomotive, and I happen to have a Chicago Northwestern MP15. Well, I stripped it down and painted it green, and that's the result. Another foobie that's fun. Part of the layout that really is a centerpiece is this lumber mill here, which was built by a gentleman, Nick Haskell, who I was friends with, and has built most of the structures on the layout. This structure in particular was an award-winning structure that when Nick decided, unfortunately, to exit the model train hobby, called me up and said, would you be interested in buying it? And I did, for a very reasonable price. It has thousands of hours of construction in it, and it's unbelievably detailed. And I will take the roof off here, as I did in the first video of my layout, to show you the incredible level of detail just on the roof trusses alone, let alone the interior of this lumber mill. Everything is detailed. There are sharpening rooms. There is the office. There is the main floor of the lumber mill. It is just an incredibly detailed model that I am honored to own. All right, the drag freight is finally rolling into Portland behind me on the lowest level, and it's the end of the modeled portion of the WP Oregon division. I want to thank you for coming and spending a little time visiting the final iteration of this layout in this location. It's been a great 13 years of learning and growing and learning new techniques. And I know that the next iteration that will arise in Reno, Nevada in the next few years is going to be even better because of everything that I've learned in the construction of this layout. So if you want to learn more about this layout and check out how it was in the beginning, click on the link and that'll take you to the first video about the WP Oregon division. Once again, thanks so much. I'm Mike Coen and I appreciate your visiting.